Chapter 5. World Famous. In the autumn of 1963, a famous American magazine laughed at British Beatles fans for their crying and screaming. But soon, Beatlemania arrived in the USA. In February 1964, the Beatles song "I Want to Hold Your Hand" was number 1 in the American charts. That month, when the Beatles went to the USA, 5,000 fans waited for their plane at New York's John F. Kennedy Airport. On the 9th of February, 73 million people watched the Beatles on the famous Ed Sullivan Show on American TV. In the New York studio, people screamed when the Beatles began to play. Outside, thousands of fans stood on Broadway and 53rd Street. No one could get through the streets. American stars like Elvis Presley were famous in Britain. Now, suddenly, Americans loved a British band. Later, British bands and singers like the Rolling Stones and Elton John became famous in the USA too. But it all began with the Beatles, that night in New York City. The Beatles played 2 concerts on their first visit to the USA, in Washington, D.C. and New York City. But they came back again in August 1964 for a 1-month, 30-concert tour of Canada and the USA. On the 23rd of August 1964, the Beatles performed at the Hollywood Bowl in Los Angeles. After the concert, they met some of Hollywood's rich and famous. When John was a boy, he watched these film stars in the Walton Cinema with his cousins. Now, they wanted to meet him. In the next 2 years, the Beatles went on tours to many countries, and there was Beatlemania around the world. People nearly died in crowds in the Philippines. In New Zealand, hundreds of fans stopped the Beatles' car, and they could not get out. In Tokyo, the band could not leave their hotel because there were thousands of fans outside. So, John, Paul, George and Ringo sat in their hotel room and made a picture. Years later, somebody bought it for $155,000. On their 3rd American tour in 1965, the Beatles visited Elvis at his house in Los Angeles. They sat and talked about music. Then they began to play guitar with him. It was amazing for John because Elvis was his hero. Friends watched while the 2 greatest names in music, the Beatles and Elvis, played together. When the Beatles were not on tour, they recorded music in London. Between 1963 and 1965, they made 6 albums, and lots of their songs, like Can't Buy Me Love, A Ticket to Ride, and We Can Work It Out, were number 1 in Britain and the USA. Thousands of people bought the records, and fans could buy Beatles t-shirts, guitars, magazines, and lots more things too. The Beatles became very rich, and John Lennon bought a big house and a very expensive car. The money was great, but some things were not easy. The Beatles could not go out for dinner or go to the shops because fans ran after them, and they quickly became tired of this. And they were not happy with their concerts because people screamed and nobody could hear their music. Some of John and Paul's songs at this time, like Help, were not happy ones. Because people loved the Beatles, they watched them on TV and read about them in magazines all the time. But sometimes the Beatles did not think carefully before they spoke. In July 1966, John said something to a magazine reporter, and American fans became very angry when they read about it. On the Beatles' fourth tour of the USA, people broke Beatles records in the street and protested outside the concerts. Some people wrote angry letters too. "You're going to die," some of them said. And Brian Epstein was afraid. Is somebody going to shoot John Lennon? He thought. Chapter 6. Family Man. In April 1964, a man walked into Brian Epstein's office and said, "I'm John Lennon's father." When John saw Alf Lennon, he was not happy. He thought, "Do I want to meet my father again after 19 years? Why did he go away all those years ago? Why did he not visit or write?" John could not forget these things. He met his father sometimes after that, but they never became good friends. John's family life was not easy. He and Cynthia had a son now, called Julian. John wanted to be a good father to Julian, but he did not have much time with his family. The Beatles were always on tour, or at the recording studios in London. So Cynthia and Julian often did not see John for weeks. And when he was at home, he worked very hard. He wrote songs all the time. And he wrote 2 books too. In the winter of 1966, John met a Japanese artist called Yoko Ono in London. They soon became very good friends. Yoko was 7 years older than John, but she was very like him. She was an artist and musician too. And, like John, Yoko had a young child, a daughter, called Kyoko. John and Cynthia soon broke up. And after that, he was with Yoko all the time. They made art together, and Yoko came to the studio when the Beatles recorded their music. On the 20th of March, 1969, Yoko and John got married in Gibraltar. Yoko Ono became Yoko Ono Lennon, and John later changed his name to John Ono Lennon. That summer, they bought a beautiful house called Tittenhurst Park. Everything in the rooms was white, and they had a beautiful garden and a recording studio. Yoko and John were happy there, and they recorded some amazing songs in the studio. Julian often came to the house, and he played with Kyoko. John and Yoko loved to do things with the children. One year, they all went on holiday to Scotland, because John remembered happy summers there with his cousins. Chapter 7. Going Solo. On the 29th of August, 1966, the Beatles performed at Candlestick Park, San Francisco. 25,000 fans listened to the Beatles that cold summer evening. But it was the band's last big concert. The Beatles did not need to do concerts and tours now. They could work in a studio and sell millions of records. They were afraid of the crowds at concerts too. Some fans got too excited. A year after the San Francisco concert, Brian Epstein died. He was only 32 years old. Epstein was an amazing manager, and a great friend too. It was very hard for the Beatles, because they were musicians, not managers. They did not manage the band well after Epstein died. They began a company called Apple, but the company lost a lot of money, and things were not easy between John, Paul, George and Ringo. On a cold winter's day in January 1969, the Beatles played together for the last time. They performed for a film on a roof in London. People stood in the street and listened. Office workers looked out of windows. Taxi drivers stopped their cars. They could not see the people on the roof, but everybody knew their songs. In the end, the police came onto the roof and stopped them because of the noise. A year later, the band began to break up. Many of their fans could not understand it. But the Beatles all wanted to do different things now, and they wanted to write different music. In 1970, all four Beatles made solo albums. After that, the four of them never played together again. John Lennon made 8 solo albums, most of them in the USA. When John wrote songs for the Beatles, they were usually about love. But the songs on his solo albums were often about the world around him, or about his life. Some of them are very sad. His second album, called Imagine, became one of the most important albums of all time. 1971 was an important year for John and Yoko. They moved to the USA. They found a house in Greenwich Village in Manhattan, and they were very happy there. New York in the 1970s was the most exciting city in the world. John and Yoko's door was always open, and they met lots of interesting people. They knew many of the best artists, writers, and musicians of their time. John and Yoko went around the city on bicycles, and John loved his life there. Chapter 8. War and Peace. The day after John and Yoko got married in 1969, they went to Amsterdam. It was an interesting week for a new husband and wife. For 7 days, they sat on their hotel bed and talked to reporters about peace. They called their war protest a bed-in, and it was on TV around the world. At the time, there were wars in many countries, like Northern Ireland, Nigeria, and Mozambique. One of the worst wars was in Vietnam. 500,000 Americans went and fought there, and every day hundreds of people died. Many people wanted to stop the war. The second bed-in protest was in Montreal, Canada, in May 1969. One day, John recorded a song called "Give Peace a Chance." There were many people in their room that day, reporters, musicians, and friends. John played the guitar and sang, and everyone became the band. They hit the tables with their hands and sang with him. It became the most famous song of the Vietnam War protest. On the 15th of November that year, hundreds of thousands of people sang "Give Peace a Chance" outside the White House in Washington, D.C. Later that year, John recorded a song called "Happy Christmas, War is Over." And John and Yoko paid for posters in 10 cities around the world. The posters said, "War is over, if you want it," in many different languages. This was John and Yoko's message to the world. After John and Yoko moved to the USA, John talked about peace on TV, and he went to many protests about wars and spoke to the crowds. Millions of young Americans listened to him, and the government was not happy. The FBI, government police, began to watch John, and they listened to his telephone. In 1972, the government wrote him a letter. "You must leave the country," the letter said. Yoko and John wanted to stay in the USA. So they talked to a lawyer called Leon Wildes. Wildes was not very interested in John's war protests or his music, but he worked very hard for John and Yoko. It took 4 years, but in the end, John Lennon could live freely in the USA. John liked the work of Gandhi and Martin Luther King. These men changed the world. But they did not do it with guns. They changed it with love, protests, and peace. Before John Lennon, rock stars and film stars did not usually talk about peace or changing the world. Today, people like Bono, Angelina Jolie, and George Clooney work hard for peace, and they help thousands of people around the world. Chapter 9. A Quiet Life. The 9th of October 1975 was a very important day for John and Yoko. Their son, Sean Taro Lennon, was born on John's 35th birthday. When John's first son, Julian, was born, he did not see him very much because he was in the Beatles. This time, he wanted to be a better father, so he stopped making music. John became a house husband. Yoko worked, and John stayed at home all day with Sean. They often went out for lunch or dinner or shopping, and they played with their cats. John did everything for Sean, and he sang to him at night. Julian sometimes visited them in the USA too. Mimi never came to New York, but John often asked her. She was afraid of the USA because many Americans had guns. John and Yoko now lived in a famous New York building called the Dakota. From their windows, you could see the trees and gardens of Central Park. John and Yoko took Sean to Central Park all the time. New Yorkers often saw them when they walked there. "Hey, John, how are you?" people called. But fans did not run after him. John loved that. John did not make any albums for 5 years, but he bought records and listened to the latest music, from glam rock to punk. He worked on his 3rd book too, and wrote lots of letters to friends, family, and fans. He did some art, and he made nice dinners at home. And he learned some Japanese, because John, Yoko, and Sean went to Japan in 1977. They stayed there all summer, and John and Sean met Yoko's family for the first time. The Lennons usually lived in their home in the Dakota, but they had a beautiful house near the sea on Long Island too. John learned to sail there, and he loved it. In June 1980, John sailed from Rhode Island to Bermuda with some friends. At first, everything went well. But then, some very bad Atlantic weather hit them. Some of John's friends became ill, so for hours John did all the sailing. He was afraid, but he stood out there in the rain and sang songs. Sean and Yoko met John and his friends when they arrived in Hamilton, Bermuda, and John stayed there with Sean for 2 months. He began to work on a new album, and he wrote some great songs, like Woman and Beautiful Boy. Then, one day, he saw a beautiful flower in the gardens in Hamilton. It was called Double Fantasy, and John loved the name. When he went back to New York, John wanted to record an album called Double Fantasy. John was excited about music again, and he began to record new songs. One day, that autumn, John and Yoko were in the recording studio all night. In the morning, they heard John's first new record, the song Just Like Starting Over, on the radio. They were very happy, and they danced around the room. Chapter 10. Dead Heroes. On the 9th of October, 1980, Sean and John had their 5th and 40th birthdays. Fans waited outside the Dakota, and at 5 p.m. they looked up and saw planes in the sky. The planes wrote a message. Happy birthday, John and Sean. Love, Yoko. 8,000 kilometers away, in Hawaii, it was 11 o'clock in the morning, and a man called Mark David Chapman could hear something in his head. Kill someone famous. 2 weeks after John's birthday, Chapman bought a gun, got a plane to New York City, and visited the Dakota. But he could not buy bullets for his gun in New York City, so he left. On the 5th of December, John talked to a reporter from a music magazine about the film star James Dean. James Dean died very young, and he became a hero for young people. I don't want to be a dead hero, John said. The next day, Mark Chapman came back to New York City. This time, he had bullets. On Monday, the 8th of December, 1980, John and Yoko left the Dakota at around 5 p.m. Chapman came up to them. He had John's new double fantasy album, and John wrote on it for him. John and Yoko worked in the recording studio that evening, and John phoned Mimi. At about 10:45 p.m., John and Yoko came back home. Their driver often drove the car into the Dakota. But it was a nice evening, so this time he stopped outside in the street. John and Yoko got out of the car. Chapman was in the street near the door of the Dakota. He took out his gun and shot John Lennon 4 times. Then he sat and waited for the police. An ambulance arrived very quickly and took John to Roosevelt Hospital. But he was dead when he arrived there. Soon, TV across the USA and the world told people, John Lennon is dead. Crowds of people came to the Dakota. He's not dead. It's not true, one girl cried. But it was. The next Sunday in Liverpool, thousands of people stood in the streets. They remembered their city's dead hero, and they listened to his songs. Across the Atlantic, in New York City's Central Park, a crowd of 150,000 people stood in the cold. Some quietly cried. Some sang John Lennon's songs. They had photos of John and big messages. Why? Read one message. We'll never forget you, read another. And they did not. New York City was John's second home. And now there is a place in Central Park called Strawberry Fields, like John's famous song. It is a quiet place, and people sit there and think. There is a memorial at Strawberry Fields too, a circle with the word Imagine in it. People leave flowers on the circle, and sometimes people leave their guitars. Every year, on the 8th of December, people meet in Central Park. They remember John's life, and they sing his songs. Thousands came in 2010, 30 years after he died. Chapter 11. Remembering John Lennon. There are many John Lennon statues and John Lennon memorials around the world. One of the best statues is near the old Cavern Club in Liverpool. It is John when he was a young Beatle. He is standing next to a building with his hands in his pockets. A young man with a big dream. The year after John died, George Harrison wrote a song about his old friend, and George, Paul and Ringo recorded it. Later, Paul McCartney remembered John in his song Here Today. There were songs by bands and singers like the Cranberries, Queen, and Elton John too. Paul, George and Ringo all became solo musicians after the Beatles broke up, and they all performed at concerts around the world. Paul McCartney became one of the greatest British singers of his time. George Harrison died in 2001, but Paul and Ringo never stopped performing. Julian and Sean Lennon became musicians like their father. They want to make the world a better place, and they do a lot of important work and help many different people. Yoko Ono finished John Lennon's last album after he died, and his last book too. She became an important artist, musician, and peace worker. She never left the Dakota. She stayed there because she wanted to remember all the good times there with him. After John died, many fans wanted to buy some of his things, like letters or albums with his writing on them. In 1982, someone bought his car for $2.23 million. But most people want to remember the man and his music. There are lots of books, magazines, and films about John Lennon, and 200,000 people buy his albums every year. When many people think about John Lennon, they remember his song, Imagine. It became one of the most important songs of all time. But it was John Lennon's message to the world too. Imagine is a song about living together in a world without hungry people and war. In the video for Imagine, John is sitting at a white piano in a white room. But the shutters on the windows are closed. Then Yoko opens the shutters. The summer sun comes into the room, and John sings. He sings of his dream, and it is a beautiful one. A dream of a better world for everyone.